our G20 presidency would seek to advocate the oneness of all in accordance with our theme, One Earth, One Family, One Future. And our priorities will reflect not just the aspirations of all of you, the G20 partners, but also the Global South, whose voice is often unheard.
Hello and welcome to the special broadcast from Udaipur, where a crucial first meeting of the G20 Sherpas is taking place. India has proposed a Green Development Pact as central to global growth at this meeting. There were also extensive consultations between emerging economies on how to have a greater say in the G20 decision-making process. Let's listen in to Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa for India, laying out India's priorities.
Our priorities are fairly ambitious. And those priorities and those issue notes will be discussed here. And on many of those issues, we will try and evolve a discussion around so that everybody gets together on these issues. Those are issues of development. Those are issues of growth. Those are issues of financial inclusion. Those are issues of social progress. And therefore, G20 should lead the world in this moment of crisis to an era of growth and development.
Right. You have in the past emphasized that we would like to focus on developing resilient, strong supply chains of food, fuel and fertilizer. This is one of the key themes as well. What progress does India really expect on this front?
So, at the G20 in Bali, these issues were discussed. Several initiatives were taken. To my mind, the key right now would be about having a very inclusive, resilient and sustainable growth, because there's a looming crisis of slowdown. Prime Minister had dwelt on this. Important thing for a forum like this is to accelerate the pace of sustainable growth over a period of time. If you need growth in a sustained manner over a period of time, digital transformation, much like what India has done. How do you provide digital identity? Close to about 4 billion people in the world do not have a digital identity. 2 billion people do not have a bank account. 133 countries in the world do not have a fast payment mechanism. And therefore, we were able to lift a vast segment because we were able to do direct benefit transfer. And all this is a key challenge. So digital transformation is going to be critical.
How many times do you expect the communique to be circulated among members before we agree upon the communique for the leaders meeting in September next year?
So that's the job of Sherpas. Communiques are not circulated. They are drafted, they are discussed, they are debated, they are, over several rounds. And therefore, it's important that we hear there are differing perceptions. We must listen to them. We must discuss. This is a forum where, apart from G20, there are a lot of bilateral discussions taking place. Yesterday night, we had a 2.5 hours discussion of emerging market economies.
Would you be seeking a special emphasis, some sort of a special package for emerging economies, including India?
See, there can't be a package for one segment. There has to be a package for the Global South. That is what the Prime Minister has emphasized, that he will be the voice of the Global South. And therefore, whatever we speak, we are speaking not only on our behalf, we are speaking on behalf of the Global South.
Now to the big message from the United States. America and India have a shared interest on the oil price cap, and US will continue looking for ways to impose a cost on Russia for the Russia-Ukraine war. The US also expects China not to oppose but agree with other G20 countries on the debt relief package needed for certain developing countries. Mike Piles, the US Deputy National Security Advisor, spoke exclusively to me. Listen in.
India has been such a constructive presence in the G20 throughout the set of discussions over the past months in terms of brokering solutions in Bali last month around the Indonesian summit, around defining a very ambitious agenda for this year's G20 presidency. We're very encouraged by the high ambition that India's put on the table. Look forward to working alongside the Indian team on issues like the reform of multilateral development banks, issues like providing debt relief to low-income countries. We're really encouraged by the path ahead.
Right. I would also like to ask you about the Ukraine-Russia war, and we have been speaking to Sherpas, and they are definitely concerned about the security aspect of it, the economic impact of the war on nations. 9 months on, what is your analysis of where we stand as far as the Ukraine-Russia war is concerned?
So I think if you roll the clock back to the Bali summit a few weeks ago, President Biden came in with two big priorities. One was for the G20 to speak in strong terms to Russia's war and the fact that that was a deep core breach of international law, but also then the spillovers that was having on the rest of the world and the global economy. He also wanted to present an affirmative vision for what it meant for the G20 to respond to those challenges around energy, around food, around debt. I think we were very happy to see those results, to see the G20 speak in such forceful terms around condemning Russia's war, around condemning the spillovers to the global economy, and then seeing some steps taken forward on energy and food such that the G20 can speak to the stresses that Russia's war has caused.
Right. But do you expect this war to continue raging on till perhaps the end of 2023, or do you feel any kind of solution is in sight?
So ultimately, this war can be ended at any moment at the decision of one man, Vladimir Putin in Russia. In the meantime, we're focused on standing beside the Ukrainian people, continuing to impose costs on Russia's economy and ability to wage war, and working with the rest of the world, including through the G20, including alongside India's presidency, to relieve and reduce the stresses that Russia's war of choice is having on the rest of the world.
Would the intensity of sanctions from the U.S. side increase now?
So we will continue to look for ways of imposing costs on Russia as they wage a immoral war of choice. We've seen recently that they've taken steps forward in terms of attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. This is unacceptable. And so we will continue to find ways of imposing costs, again, while recognizing that Russia's war of choice is imposing costs on the rest of the world, including the developing world. And the United States is going to stand with the rest of the world, including through the G20, to look to relieve those pressures that Russia is causing.
Right. About relieving pressures, there was a meeting of emerging economies yesterday at the Sherpas meeting in Udaipur. There is a concern about how these sanctions are impacting developing economies. How would you address those concerns?
So I'd say let's just focus on where these stresses are coming from. Stresses on energy, stresses on food. They have a proximate cause, and it's Russia's choice to invade Ukraine, to wage war against their neighbor. That is the source of the stresses we're seeing on energy and food. It's why the United States has been so focused on working alongside allies, partners through the G20 to relieve pressures on global food supply chains. We saw constructive steps forward, for example, with respect to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is continuing to get Ukrainian grain out to global markets. We've taken steps forward, including through the price cap recently, which is designed to preserve energy supply in global markets while allowing developing markets to pay less for that energy. These are the types of steps that we're taking to relieve the pressures out there for the emerging world by virtue of Russia's war of choice and the consequences that that's having for the world economy.
The G7 price cap has come into effect. Would you want India and other nations to also accept that? Would that be a point you would make at the G20?
So the price cap that the G7 and a set of allied partners have announced has two goals. The first goal is to preserve stability and supply in global oil and energy markets, and the second is, as best as possible, to limit additional revenue that Russia receives by virtue of selling its oil, its energy on global markets. We think that as it relates to India, as it relates to other emerging economies around the world, we have an important shared interest with India around the price cap. Just like U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses want to see lower energy bills. So too do Indian households, Indian businesses. And we think the price cap provides a tool for India, for other energy-consuming countries to go in and drive a stronger bargain to lower the prices that they're paying for energy, and as a result to relieve pressure on their own economies, on their own households, while preserving that access and supply in global energy markets.
Right. So the Indian Prime Minister has spoken about the need to depoliticize supply chains of food, fertilizer and energy so that we don't end up in a humanitarian crisis. When it comes to forming strong, resilient supply chains, what can the G20 do, and what would be the roadmap that you would be giving?
So we very much share with Prime Minister Modi a focus on having strong, resilient supply chains. Certainly, the aftermath of the pandemic has only highlighted the extent to which supply chains under stress, supply chains that aren't sufficiently resilient, can lead to significant strains across the global economy. I would say, though, when it comes to places like energy and food, again, I would turn the focus back to Russia. That is a country that's chosen to weaponize access to food, weaponize access to energy, weaponize the stresses that have resulted on global supply chains, and that's unacceptable. And again, that's why we're really highlighting the costs that their actions are imposing on the rest of the world, as well as our efforts to relieve those pressures on places like food and energy supply chains.
Right. My final two questions, Mike. Russia is very much in this room when it comes to the G20. Would you want nations to hold Russia accountable? Would you hope that somewhere the G20 can come together to bring this war to an end?
So I think if you looked at the leader's statement last month in Bali, you saw a couple of things. You saw most of the members of the G20 come together to strongly condemn, in the strongest terms, Russia's war in Ukraine, and also collectively to see that Russia's war is having impacts on the global economy, is imposing stresses on us all. I think what you heard from the G20 as well is ultimately a belief that today's era must not be one of war. That's certainly something the United States believes. And again, I would just highlight that, it's one person here has the choice to end this tomorrow, to end these stresses on the global economy, to end the war of aggression in Ukraine, and that's Vladimir Putin of Russia.
You've got China in the room. China has emerged stronger after President Xi's third term, and what would be your expectation from China, considering they have a major role to play when it comes to debt restructuring and any debt relief package for any country is concerned?
So the issue of debt relief is absolutely essential right now. We're seeing low-income countries, middle-income countries, including countries like Sri Lanka, go through periods of very considerable debt distress right now. A common denominator in a lot of these particular cases is the role that China plays as a bilateral lender. I think one of the things that we've consistently said we think the broad G20 has said is that China needs to play a constructive role in stepping forward and offering debt relief and debt restructuring on similar terms to what everybody else is willing to offer. We saw last month in Bali, we saw in October when finance ministers came together that every member of the G20 except China, adopts that as the way they're approaching this issue. We think that a core part of the India G20 presidency, something that we're very excited to work alongside the Indian presidency on, is precisely continuing to highlight this issue, continuing to highlight it at the leaders level, and hope and expect that as we run the clock forward through 2023, that China is going to take a constructive approach in relieving some of these burdens on low and middle income countries.
Finally, would you like to give any priorities for the bilateral engagement between India and US as far as the G20 goes, or the trajectory of India-US ties going ahead?
So I would just say I've been tremendously encouraged with the productivity, the constructiveness, the warmth of the engagement between the United States and India, both the G20 and more broadly. I think we have a lot of shared priorities around the G20. We've talked about a couple of them, including reform of the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank, including priorities like debt relief. including relieving the ongoing stresses from Russia's war around energy and food for the world as a whole. These are things that we're focused on working together on, and the constructiveness and warmth of the engagement to date has been very encouraging.
So clearly, G20 nations want constructive talks, but there is implicit tension in the room over the Ukraine-Russia war. We take a short break, but don't go anywhere. When we return, we speak to Sherpas of the OECD and Indonesia. Welcome back. You are watching our special broadcast on the G20 Sherpas meeting here in Udaipur. Clearly, there is a lot of concern among diplomats on the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war. We spoke to OECD's Sherpa, Andreas Schall, about OECD's outlook for the global economy and also the need for a cryptocurrency framework.
The atmosphere in the room is a very constructive one, thanks to the lead and preparation of the Indian presidency. Of course, the war in Ukraine plays a role in the conversations because it has also an economic impact, an impact on the global economy, an impact on inflation, an impact on energy prices. So it's there, but the atmosphere is constructive to find common solution to global economic problems.
Do you expect tensions in the negotiations? Did you see some sort of tensions in the opening remarks, opening priorities laid out by countries today?
I mean, of course, as I said, the situation is what it is. There is a war against Ukraine, and there are geopolitical tensions which you cannot neglect in such an environment. But I see a constructive spirit since leaders have reached an agreement on a joint declaration in Bali. And I see the willingness to support India's presidency on its priorities and on find solutions, because the problems like climate change, other trade and investment issues will not go away just because there are geopolitical tensions. So we need to face it and fix it.
What would be your outlook, and this is important for the G20 to note, while we see this war raging on, what kind of impact is it going to have on the world economy this year and in the next calendar year?
I mean, we are not projecting a global recession in our most recent economic outlook, but we clearly see a slowdown in global growth perspective. So the war is having an impact. It's having an impact on inflation. We are projecting 6.6% of inflation this year on a global scale. It has an impact on energy prices, on food security, and we see ourselves, I mean, it's almost a flashback into the 70s, because, I mean, I was born in '69, and my first impression was walking on a Sunday with no cars driving anymore on the streets in Germany because of the energy crisis and because of the energy shock. And this current situation has brought energy prices back to the level what we have not seen since the 70s.
Question would be on cryptocurrencies. The world is concerned after the recent collapse that we've seen in one major exchange, FTX. How do you think cryptocurrencies can threaten the stability of the global financial system? And what conversation can we expect at the G20 on this?
I mean, first of all, I think cryptocurrency and the use of cryptocurrency is an opportunity. It's a new technology. We have been looking at the OECD into it from a viewpoint of blockchains, the use of in commercial transaction. At the same time, we also need to see that it's a bit like the beginning of the internet. If you don't have a proper, transparent regulatory framework, you have these risks of failures, you have these risks of also tax evasion. So we, for example, did last year a report for the G20 on crypto assets and the role in the international taxation system. This is works we continue. We're working with other international organizations to have a proper framework without over-regulating a growing sector, but with really having a reliable and transparent regulation for it. I mean, it's like if you had no central banks, if you had no regulation or no framework for the free flow of money, there would be also problems with the money. So we need to have a secure and stable, reliable framework for that.
So how urgent a priority should this be for the G20 to come up with a proper framework, transparent framework?
I mean, I think this is an ongoing conversation, and as said, I mean, we also need to be, one would need to be careful to have a transparent framework, but not to over-regulate a growing growing sector. And this is a conversation which has started, which of course, due to recent events you mentioned, the failure is a bit more in the visibility, but it's probably too important to be urgent, but it's something which also you would not put on the long, as we say in German, on the long bench. So we need to address it, but we have to see how far we need to explore the opportunities and the institutional possibilities on this.
Also, the other major concern among G20 Sherpas was how the world has fallen back on sustainable development goals. We caught up with Indonesia's Sherpa and also UN diplomats on the challenges and priorities for India during its G20 presidency.
The essence of the G20 is always the continuity. So that's why it still have a lot of things that we should be done, especially in the energy transition. Even we already have a principle, but we have to move forward into the implementation. But at least now we have a grips how to solve about the climate change. And of course, digital transformation. Even we have a lot of benefits, but another thing that we still have a problem about the digital divide. And of course, we also need to have implementation. And health, maybe we already have a setup for the preparedness, but how then we have to bring into the arrangement, how the financial channeling also into the emerging market. So it's also another issues like women's development, youth, anything. So that's where we have to bring this into in the next presidency.
I think, in a word or in a phrase, I would say SDGs. That was the point of the discussion today. As the UN Secretary General has noted in his report, we're being pushed backwards on hard-won progress on the SDGs globally. No country really is escaping that. Hundreds of millions of people are being pushed into poverty. And so we have to understand how can we achieve both responding firefighting to these immediate crises while at the same time not losing focus on the medium and longer term issues of climate change, for example, impacting every country. We've seen that certainly here in India. So I think what we did today in the panel discussion, we focused on what we considered 4 particularly urgent accelerators, and that is the digital transition, how to leverage really the digital economy, and here again, India really is one of the leaders in the world in terms of digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. Just for example, financial inclusion of women through digital fintech. The second is just green transition. So understanding that we have to transition to a green economy, we have to move away from fossil fuels. Right. At the same time, that has to also accommodate the right to development of developing countries and communities at the same time. Right. So we have to be, all transitions have to be just.
Okay, I'd also like to ask you about women-led development, women empowerment. There are 2 tracks in the G20 as far as women empowerment, greater representation of women in workplace is concerned. What can we do that the G20 actually takes it forward rather than this remaining on paper?
Right. Well, so actually, that's the third point is women-led development, and here, we very much draw on the Prime Minister Modi's positioning of women-led development as a national priority that has, found its way through as a priority of India's G20 presidency. So here, really, it's understanding. A number of different things. We had Ambassador Lakshmi Puri speaking about that on the panel. First of all, it's about data. We need information to be able to drive policies that are inclusive for women and providing both women's human rights, of course, but also ensuring that our economies, our communities can be prosperous, because if we don't have women at the table in management decision-making opportunities, women fully participating, then society is not taking advantage of half of its human potential. This is very, very clear. So lots of tools. Education, ensuring women have equal opportunity to education. Here, for example, India's done very well in STEM. Women are essentially at parity in terms of science, technology, participation in education. but translating that into jobs, getting women into the workforce, labor participation, that's the next challenge. How do we bring companies forward to ensure that women are given opportunities? How do we ensure that women have equal opportunity to access to financing, especially those who are leading medium and small enterprises as well? So there are a number of different tools, and what's really encouraging is that India's G20 presidency is looking at women's empowerment as a core priority. So we're confident that that this G20 process will come out with some important decisions.
Coming to an agreement on the G20 outcomes is going to be a challenging task for India. The G20 communique is going to be discussed and drafted at least 4 times before being agreed upon during the leaders' meeting in September 2023. That's all we have time for on this special broadcast. Thank you for watching and goodbye.